Thank you, Dominique. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, good. Thank you so much for having me. I feel extra special that I'll be the last in-person seminar, maybe forever. No, I'm kidding. It's really a pleasure to be here. There's a lot of people that I love or appreciate in Madison, and it's my first time, so I'm really happy to be here. To have a conversation about inclusive science communication. So this is my Twitter handle, so if you want to tweet, feel free to tweet, take pictures of the slides. I always assume that whatever I'm going to say will be used against me, so it's fine to share what I will be saying today. So science and science communication, we've made progress, but despite of that progress, historically marginalized and minoritized individuals, they continued to be overlooked and undervalued in science and in science communication. Now, this is something that I think about a lot. It's something that I get asked about a lot. How do we make science more inclusive, equitable, and representative? And notice that I'm not using the word diversity because I feel like the word diversity has lost its meaning. People equate diversity, inclusion, and equity, and they're not similar. Just increasing the number of marginalized folks in one space does not make inclusion. So, you know, moving the needle on inclusion and equity is hard work, and there's no magical checklist. Like, I can't give you a formula or a protocol or a list of steps, and when you're done, you are done. Like, you get a certificate, congratulations, you're inclusive. It doesn't work like that. And so to do this, to make science and science communication more inclusive, more equitable, more representative, we need to reframe our approaches, because the way that we have been doing things for decades, sure, things have improved, but they haven't improved enough. And again, this is something that I think about a lot, and I'm a scientist by training. I work with a lot of scientists, and so recently I started thinking, you know, what can I give people? Is there a tool, is there a framework that I can provide for people to help them think about inclusion or on their own? Is there a set of questions that I can provide so that they can go back and kind of check in with those questions every so often for science communication projects, but really for anything, for science learning, for science itself? I think this framework applies for different things. So I came up with this 4-dimensional framework that has 4 lenses: awareness, perspectives, challenges, and action. So I'm going to walk through this framework, and I'm going to share some examples from my own work of how I use this to think about making science communication more inclusive. Let's start with awareness. In order to foster inclusion, we need to constantly work on our awareness. We need to constantly grow our awareness of different backgrounds, of different cultures, of different abilities, of inequities and inequalities, and the differences between those. Can anybody tell me what the difference between inequities and inequalities is? Crickets. So inequities or equity is about justice, and equality is about, is it even or not? So although they're related, they're different concepts, and it's important that we separate them out. We also need to increase our awareness about biases. We're all human. We all have them. You know, whoever tells you, like, I'm a scientist, I'm objective, they're full of shit. I can say shit, right? I mean, I just did, it's fine. You know, we have to be aware of tokenism. You know, you don't want to put your only black person on your video or your brochure just to be like, look, we have black people. It doesn't, no, don't do that. You also have to be aware of stereotypes. What are some stereotypes about particular groups? And how might you underscore those stereotypes? How are you reinforcing those stereotypes? Or how can you work against those? And so I've been the lead producer of Backcountry Breakthrough. It's a series of short films that essentially want to change the narrative about scientists of color. One of the inspirations behind this series was my own experiences, but also the experiences of many of my friends and colleagues, that when our own stories are told, or when we hear stories of scientists of color, they're usually told from a perspective of deficit. It's this person, you know, they grew up here and they overcame so many challenges, and yay, they're scientists now, congratulations. And what I wanted to do with this series was tell the opposite. I wanted to talk about how these people's life experiences, cultural background, how those challenges that they might have faced, how they succeed because of them and not in spite of them. So we have interviewed 3 scientists so far: Dr. Esteban Gonzalez-Burchard, who is at the University of California, San Francisco; Dr. Rebecca Calici Rodriguez, who was at the University of California, Davis; and Dr. Manu Prakash, who is at Stanford University. So I'm going to share some clips from these videos. You can find them in this short URL. I'll have it on my last slide, so if you want to watch the full videos, or please watch the full videos, you again can take a picture and go to them later on. So biases. When I was working on Rebecca's video, one of the things that I was particularly aware was biases that people might have against women in science who are also mothers, who are also Mexican American, Chicanas, which is some of the identities that Rebecca represents. So I wanted to make sure that in the video about her, we gave equal weight to her research, and we didn't just focus on talking about her advocacy for mothers in science, or her path from being a graphic or a plastic artist and how she used that to then transition into science. I wanted to make sure that her research on the neurobiology of parental behavior was as prominent as these other parts of her life.
I made it to UC Berkeley and started this program in integrative biology. All through grad school, I had really had my eye on this particular organism that I thought would be a perfect animal to help us unravel the mysteries of parental care behavior. And that organism is the pigeon. The common pigeon that many of us see, you know, outside grabbing our French fries off our plates, eating birdseed from the old lady in the park, those pigeons. And the reason why is because, just like us, are you ready for this? Mom lactates. What they do is they produce crop milk. So they have this sac behind their throat, and they feed it solely to their babies for their first few days of their life. Now, it gets even cooler, because not just mom lactates, dad does too. So this is one of our aviaries. Now, pigeons have been used as models to study reproduction since the days of Darwin. And recently, they've been gaining a lot of momentum as study subjects for genomics research, which is one of the techniques we use to study how they can reproduce. So these are sections of the brain, in this case, the hypothalamus. This is the area we specifically investigate to understand what genes are active at certain times of parental care behaviors. What we have found are the many genes that activate or deactivate in accordance with certain stages of parental care. But we have also discovered new genes that the field wasn't even aware of that could potentially help to regulate parental care behaviors.
Something else I was very aware of were stereotypes. I wanted to make sure, because the goal of these videos is to flip common narratives, I wanted to make sure that we were not inadvertently reinforcing certain stereotypes about the people that we were featuring on these videos. And so one of the things that I had to do in preparation for all of the interviews and the production is I had to do a lot of research on these people. I had to essentially stalk them on Google. And so I had to read a lot about them. I had to read their research papers. I had to find what videos had been produced about them because, you know, I wanted to tell a different story, like different stories from what already existed. And as I was doing my research on Esteban, I found this article on BuzzFeed. So Esteban studies health disparities in minority populations suffering from asthma. So he looks at genetics and race disparities. And as I started reading this article, I was taken aback because it started like this. Esteban Burchard is pissed. He's angry that people of color are being sidelined by a medical revolution spawned by the Human Genome Project. He's angry that when non-white scientists apply for federal dollars to try and turn things around, they find the deck stacked against them. And he's angry that he, a middle-aged Latino man with a wrestler's build, can't walk his dogs without getting stopped by the police. So I read this and I was like, what the fuck? Like, I mean, we should all be angry about this. I'm angry about this. But he's pissed one time and he's angry 3 times. He is a Latino man with a wrestler's build. Like, he used to be a wrestler. And yet, here is this writer being like, he's angry. Did you get that? He's angry? He's very angry. And so, you know, because the videos that we were producing were precisely about this work, I was really aware of avoiding this anger or angry stereotype, the angry Latino stereotype in our videos.
It's very difficult to separate the idea of race from its biologic component or the genetic ancestry because they're interrelated. And in medicine, there are very clear examples where we know that race is very important and it's applied in medicine every day. Race is a social construct, but it includes biologic aspects like genetic ancestry. And I view race as a shopping cart that contains lots of information that's relevant for clinical and biomedical research. So for example, minority populations tend to live in impoverished areas, which tend to be exposed to higher levels of air pollution. They tend to face higher levels of discrimination. That has nothing to do with their biology, but it does have health consequences. So the idea of race will never go away in medicine. It's a good epidemiologic proxy for a lot of information. Well, here's the problem. Anytime you get a clinical measure, we need to compare you to a reference population. In the United States, the Office of Management and Budgets, OMB, has designated 5 racial groups: African American, white, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and Native American. And they've classified 2 ethnic groups. You're either Hispanic or non-Hispanic. That's an archaic terminology that really doesn't fit. So for example, I'm Latino, identifying as Mexican, but my genetic ancestry actually has 3 racial groups: Native American, African, and European. So I have 3 racial groups within me. I identify as being Hispanic, and I don't neatly fit into any one of those boxes. That's a conundrum. How do we diagnose President Obama? Is he black or is he white? When I was in training at UCSF as a pulmonary physician, I saw a patient who was African American, light skinned, looked like Obama, and he had an occupational injury where he inhaled toxic fumes. At the end of the test, it came down to comparing him to a reference standard. Depending upon the pull down, I could change the outcome of his results. If I called him black, he would not have qualified. If I called him white, he would have qualified for benefits. The technician said, well, he looks black. And I said, well, clinically, he's 50-50, so we'd get it wrong either way. And so I erred on the side of making him qualify for disability benefits. I labeled him as white. When I first encountered that experience in the pulmonary function lab at UCSF, it really opened my eyes to the fact that race is in the background, and we are making clinical decisions based on standards that were developed for different racial groups. And it has real life clinical implications. The consequences of the one-size-fits-all approach in medicine is that there are going to be groups of populations that will be harmed, in that they'll either be misdiagnosed, overdiagnosed, or not benefit from modern therapeutic interventions. There are many systematic issues on a scientific level, cultural level, institutional level that have led to the fact that we have very few minority physicians and scientists, as well as very few studies in minority populations, but they go hand in hand.
So in his interviews, Esteban talks about many of the things that BuzzFeed's article said he was angry about, but he's not angry when he's talking. Like, you know, one of the things we wanted to do with these videos is we wanted people to talk at the camera because we wanted the audience to really feel like they were having a conversation with them about the different issues that they're discussing. He doesn't shy away from sharing his frustration at times, but is he angry? He's not. All right, so let's talk about perspectives. When you're telling a story, producing a video, a podcast, whatever it is, you have to think about, who's the protagonist? Who's the spokesperson for this issue? Like, who are they? And what does that say about the issue? What does that say about what you're trying to accomplish? But also, as the communicator, as the storyteller, you have to think about your own perspectives. And, you have to think about the biases that you might bring into a story, but you also want to think about, what are the unique experiences that I bring that can inform what I'm doing to make it more inclusive. You want to think about who is represented, like what are the individuals, what are the communities, what are the issues. Like, for example, if we wanted to talk about environmental stewardship in the state of Wisconsin, are we talking about the Ho-Chunk tribes and the stolen land that we're standing on? Are we talking about their practices and how they've been environmental stewards forever, since we were even imagining being born? Are we talking about that? Is that a community that is being represented in what we're doing? We also want to think about framing. So, what's the framing of the story? Can you bring a new perspective to a story? And this question of framing was something I was asking myself a lot when I was producing the video about Manu Prakash. So Manu is, he's really well known for inventing low-cost origami microscope, or foldscope. And so it's an incredible invention. He creates all of these tools that he calls frugal science. So it's really about low-cost tools for research, for curiosity, for education. And Manu he's won MacArthur's Genius Award. He's been a TED Fellow. So there's a lot about him out there. But most of what I had seen up to the point when we produced this video was really about the invention, which is great. Like, the inventions he's creating are outstanding. But I really wanted to know, what was it about him? What was it about him growing up as a poor kid in India that brought him to the point where he is getting world acclaim for the things that he is inventing?
Most of my childhood was in this small town called Rampur. If you ever watch a Bollywood movie, they talk about this knife called Rampuri Chaku that used to be made only in that region in the country. So I had this strange fascination with manufacturing really early on. And I think I was just very fortunate that the house that we remembered living the most in essentially had an abandoned lab. There were cobwebs everywhere, so there was a sense of mystery to it. I mean, it could be a telescope or it could be a time machine. I mean, I had no idea. We would play with the cows and the animals very much in the same way we would play with this sophisticated scientific instrument. It was just an abandoned space with objects that I could play with, and they were our toys without really knowing what they meant. And my brother and I spent 3 or 4 years just really both organizing that lab and just doing things that I would, from the current standard, describe were quite dangerous. The very first thing I remember making was this devil that during a festival you essentially light up on fire. We made these explosive boats to depict how oil spills actually work. You can see there's a fire theme in my childhood. I think that's when I remember I built my very first microscope. And we didn't have a source of lenses, so I actually stole my brother's eyeglasses. And for a day or two, he was really upset because that was his only pair of eyeglasses. And then I reached high school, and the system works in a very specific way. I mean, in India, tens of millions of kids apply for these exams that you have to pass before you could get into a good engineering school or a good medical school. And these exams were about books. They were not about what I was making. None of my experience counted. And it was a complete U-turn from my personality. I was sitting on a chair for 16 hours a day preparing for that exam. But the only way that I survived was those childhood days came back slowly. And most of what I do in my lab now reflects back on that open-ended creativity and curiosity.
For me, that was it. When I remember when we were doing the interview and he said that, I was like, that's where it started. Like, he talked about that knife and all of the things he used to make. Like, manufacturing was part of his culture. It is part of his culture. It's part of his upbringing, and it very much drives a lot of what he does today in his lab. Inclusion work is not without challenges. It is hard work. And so inevitably, you're just going to have to deal with challenges and roadblocks. So I'll talk about the easy ones first. Time and budget, so more logistical or practical challenges. So, I wish I could have all the money in the world and all the time in the world to produce videos like this one. I don't. And so sometimes that means that you have to make decisions about who you portray or how you portray things. But it doesn't mean that you can be like, well, I just didn't have the time, so I'm going to be lazy. I'm going to do this instead. There are ways in which you can be inclusive in spite of these challenges. The other one is characters. Sometimes if you're a writer, for example, you're told you're going to interview this person. You're going to talk about, the history of how the structure of DNA was elucidated. And so that means that you're going to have to talk about Watson and Crick. But hopefully that means that you're also going to get on the wave of people who are finally recognizing Rosalind Franklin and the contributions that she made, and that were ignored and erased from history for a long time. Now there's some people that are even talking about Watson, Franklin, and Crick, or whatever order it is that they're talking about it. If you're talking about genetics, like you might actually want to talk about genetics and race and how Watson is a misogynist racist. You can talk about that. I mean, it's a known fact. I'm not making it up. He is a misogynist racist. You can look it up. And so, you can do that. You're still going to talk about him. You're still going to talk about the scientific contributions that he made, but don't just give me like, well, he's a complicated guy, but he was a great scientist. Like, you can move beyond that. By the way, I've seen people do that. Be like, well, he's a complicated man. I'm like, you mean he's a racist? Yes. And so to deal with the inevitable challenges of inclusion and equity work, you need to tap into your awareness. You need to be constantly growing your awareness. You need to be constantly seeking new perspectives, and that means you're going to have to talk to people that are different from you, and that means that you're going to sit down and shut up and listen to them. You're not going to be like, well, but this is my experience, but no, you're going to listen to what they have to say so that you can learn from them. And then you're going to have to own your mistakes. You will make mistakes. You will make multiple mistakes. I was giving a talk at the end of last year, and I was having lunch with a group of students, and we were going to talk about inclusion and challenges that they were facing at their institution with not feeling included in a variety of spaces. And because this was, it was a sensitive topic, we wanted to kind of do an icebreaker. So I asked people to stand up and do this little improv game in which you count from 1 to 3, and then you replace each of the numbers with an action. And, after I did this, people were like, yeah, ha, ha, ha. And they did it, and we carry on with the conversation. And later on, one of the students stood up and talked about how they had a autoimmune disease that made it very hard for them to sometimes even stand up. And when she said that, I was like, you idiot. And I said, right there, I thanked her for sharing that with us, and I apologized. And I was like, I am so sorry. I'm here to talk about inclusion, and yet I wasn't inclusive of people with different physical abilities like you. And so I made a mistake, and I owned it right there. Did I feel shitty? I did. Did I feel like an idiot? Absolutely. But it was a learning moment. And so getting comfort, like becoming comfortable with that discomfort, is a very important part of the process of becoming more inclusive and equitable in your work. Finally, let's talk about action. So I'm an action-oriented person, and when I think about the stories that I'm telling, I'm thinking about how can they inspire or spark critical discussions about issues of race, of discrimination, of curiosity, about whatever it is. And so one of the things that I've been doing is I have been going to classrooms. So this was at San Francisco State University. There's a science communication class for biology master students. And so I showed some of the videos. I showed Esteban Bouchard's videos. There's 3 of them. And we talked about race. We talked about, their concerns about, what does it mean that people like me are not included in clinical trials? Like, what does it mean for my family, for treating, like, my asthma? And so, one of the things that I enjoy the most about screening these videos are the things that they inspire in people, because, I can think about, oh, people are going to think about this and that, but I'm always very surprised by the things that come up. We also did a screening at the Bay Area Science Festival, so it was open to the community, and we had kids and families come and watch the videos and talk about them. So I'm constantly thinking about, how can these videos be a tool for more? How can my stories be a tool to go further? I also think a lot about accountability, because this is a difficult problem. And if you're not accountable to yourself, and if you're not accountable to others, like, are you actually being inclusive? Are you doing the hard work, or are you walking the talk? And so I think a lot about, how can I make myself accountable? Like, can I be vulnerable enough that when someone says, it's hard for me to stand up and you made me stand up, am I being accountable enough to that group of people and saying, I'm sorry, I wasn't great, I made a mistake? Am I willing to call out my colleagues when they say something like, actually, no, that's not right, and here is why? Am I willing to put myself on the line? And now, that also ties to leadership. And particularly when it comes to systemic inclusion, like actually moving the needle, like, it's not just science communication that's not inclusive, or science that it's not inclusive, is academia that it's not inclusive, it's society that is not inclusive. So this is a big problem, and it requires leadership. It requires individual leadership, and it requires institutional leadership. Now, I'm all about grassroots movements. Like, a lot of my community work has been at the grassroots level. But I also understand that if we want to create big change, leadership has to do work and they have to be accountable to the people that they serve. So this is something that I think a lot about, and I recognize that you can't always hold particular leadership accountable, especially if there's a power differential. I know, so I'm a Puerto Rican Latinx woman, but I pass as white. Unless I open my mouth, people are like, "Hi, white lady." And I know that gives me privileges. And so I'm constantly thinking about, how do I leverage that? There are times in which I have to choose my battles and maybe not say something. And I feel horrible when that happens. But sometimes I have to choose my own safety. I have to choose keeping a job. I have to choose keeping, a seat in a committee because I don't want to piss someone off. So sometimes you have to make those hard decisions, but this is something like accountability and leadership, both individual and collectively, is something I'm constantly thinking about and that I invite you to think about as you're thinking, how do I become more inclusive? So before I end, I want to give you a couple or 3 more resources. There's an organization called Chicago Beyond, and they have, in 2018, they published a guidebook called Why Am I Always Being Researched? And it's a guidebook for community organizations, researchers, and funders, but I think it has a lot of really valuable lessons and as a really great framework that can help you as, if you're interested in science communication. I think it really is valuable for anyone. But it's really focused on equity. How do we make work? How do we make research? How do we make partnerships more equitable? The Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education published also a guidebook at the end of 2018 that is focused on broadening participation in science, technology, engineering, and math. And they have some really great resources. A lot of their work is more directly relevant to science communication. One of the things that I appreciate about what they did is they have briefs and worksheets that you can use to have difficult conversations. So sometimes talking about inclusion, particularly with a group of people that are maybe not thinking about this, can be very hard, and they have some pointers on how to have those difficult conversations. And then the last thing is a collection of inclusive science communication in theory and practice papers in the journal Frontiers in Communication. I'm actually one of the topic editors for this special issue. So we have I think about 6 articles that have been published so far. We have more coming, and they're all focused on research, perspectives, case studies that are centered around inclusive science communication. So to make science more inclusive, more equitable, more representative, we know that we have to change the way we've been doing things. We have to reframe our approaches. And while this is not easy, I hope that the framework that I've shared with you today is going to help you think more critically about your awareness, your perspectives. What are the challenges that you're facing? What are some actions that you can take to make science and science communication a more inclusive and equitable space? So with that, I'll thank you and I'll take your questions. Thanks.